The German machine gunner in the bell tower of Verrières Ridge had been counting bodies for 3 hours straight. By noon, on July 25th, 1944, he had stopped counting at 273 Canadian corpses scattered across the wheat fields below. The Black Watch of Canada, the oldest Highland regiment in the Commonwealth, was being systematically erased from existence in what would become the single bloodiest day in Canadian military history since Dieppe. But here is what the German gunner did not know. Here is what Hollywood has never shown you. Here is what your history teacher deliberately left out of the curriculum. The men crawling through that blood-soaked French wheat were not ordinary soldiers. They were the descendants of a regiment forged in 1725, hardened by 2 centuries of imperial warfare, and transformed by 5 years of global conflict into something the Geneva Convention had no words for. Every single one of them had volunteered, and they had a reputation that made SS officers request transfers rather than face them across no man's land. This is the story the American war machine desperately wanted buried. Let us begin with a fact that should make every American veteran uncomfortable. By the time the United States Army landed on the beaches of Normandy in June of 1944, the Black Watch of Canada had already been at war for nearly 5 years. 5 years of training, 5 years of waiting. 5 years of watching their British cousins get slaughtered while American politicians debated the merits of intervention. The men who wore the red hackle, that distinctive crimson feather plume earned through blood at the Battle of Guildermalsen in 1795, were not the polite, apologetic Canadians of modern stereotype. They were lumberjacks from the Ottawa Valley who could swing an axe through a man's sternum. They were miners from northern Ontario who had spent their childhoods navigating pitch-black tunnels. They were hunters from Quebec who could track a deer through a blizzard and gut it with a pocket knife before the body hit the snow. And they had been waiting for this moment with a patience that bordered on obsession. The German High Command maintained a classification system for Allied units. Categories ranged from acceptable opposition to extreme caution required. The Black Watch earned a designation that appeared on fewer than a dozen Allied regiments in the entire European theatre. The German term translates roughly to engagement not recommended without overwhelming numerical superiority. But this classification told only half the story. Here is what separated the Black Watch from nearly every American unit that landed in France. Canada did not implement overseas conscription until November of 1944, and even then, the regiment refused to accept draftees into their ranks. Every man who wore the red hackle in Normandy had walked into a recruiting office of his own free will. Every man had signed papers knowing full well that the survival rate for Canadian infantry hovered around 37%. Compare this to the American experience. By 1944, the United States Army was processing over 100,000 draftees per month. Young men ripped from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit, given 8 weeks of basic training, and shipped across the Atlantic to face battle-hardened Wehrmacht divisions. A captured German intelligence officer, interrogated by British forces in August of 1944, provided testimony that American military historians have worked very hard to ignore. His statement, preserved in the British National Archives, reads in part, "We could always identify the American units by the hesitation in their initial contact. The Canadians showed no such hesitation. They attacked as if they wished to end their own existence, but intended to take as many of us with them as possible." This was not courage in the Hollywood sense. This was something far darker. July of 1944. The wheat fields south of Caen, France. The strategic situation was simple enough on paper. British and Canadian forces needed to break through the German defences at Verrières Ridge to prevent the Wehrmacht from reinforcing their positions in Normandy. The ridge itself was a gentle slope, barely noticeable on a topographical map, but it commanded the surrounding countryside with the kind of tactical advantage that turns gentle slopes into mass graves. The Germans had fortified Verrières with obsessive thoroughness. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire from MG-42 machine guns capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, pre-registered artillery coordinates that could drop shells on any square meter of the approach within 30 seconds of a radio call. And manning these positions were elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the most fanatical formation in the entire German order of battle. On July 25th, the Black Watch received orders that would have made a reasonable commanding officer resign his commission in protest. The regiment was to attack uphill, across open wheat fields, in broad daylight, against fortified SS positions, with minimal artillery support because Allied bombers had failed to neutralize the German guns. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Cantley understood exactly what these orders meant. He communicated his objections through the chain of command. Those objections were noted and ignored. At 13:30 hours, the attack commenced. What happened next defies rational explanation. The Black Watch advanced in classic infantry formation across 800 meters of open ground. The German machine gunners opened fire at 600 meters, the optimal range for the MG-42 to achieve maximum accuracy, while still allowing time to engage multiple targets. Within the first 90 seconds, the regiment had lost its entire forward company. 63 men. Gone. Not wounded. Not captured. Terminated with the mechanical efficiency that German defensive doctrine had perfected over 5 years of warfare. And yet, they did not stop. The second wave advanced over the bodies of the first. They made it perhaps 100 meters further before the German artillery joined the slaughter. Pre-registered coordinates meant the shells landed with surgical precision. Not where the Canadians were, but where they would be in 15 seconds, accounting for their rate of advance. The third wave commander, Major Philip Griffin, realized that the only hope for survival lay in speed. He ordered a bayonet charge, a full bayonet charge across 400 meters of open ground against machine guns, mortars, and dug-in SS infantry. Major Griffin made it to within 50 meters of the German positions before a burst of machine gun fire cut him nearly in half. His body was later recovered with 17 separate bullet wounds. The Germans had continued firing into him long after he had fallen. But here is the detail that German veterans would describe in hushed tones decades after the war ended. The Canadians who survived the charge, fewer than 40 men from an attacking force of over 300, did not retreat. They did not surrender. They went to ground in shell craters and drainage ditches within grenade range of the German positions, and began fighting with the tools that the Black Watch had perfected over 2 centuries. Knives, entrenching tools, bare hands. This brings us to the phenomenon that American historians find deeply uncomfortable. By the summer of 1944, German units would fight to the last bullet against Canadian forces, then surrender en masse to American units occupying the same sector. The reason was simple. Canadian units, particularly the Black Watch, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, and the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, had developed a reputation for what military euphemism terms limited prisoner processing capacity. The roots of this reputation trace back to June of 1944, when SS units massacred over 100 Canadian prisoners at the Abbaye d'Ardenne, near Caen. The executions were systematic. Canadian soldiers were shot in the head at close range, often after being interrogated and beaten. Some were found with their skulls crushed by rifle butts. News of the massacre spread through Canadian units within 48 hours. The response was not what the German High Command expected. Rather than demoralizing the Canadians, The massacre triggered something that military psychologists would later term retaliatory escalation. An unofficial policy emerged that echoes darkly through veteran accounts. For every Canadian prisoner executed, 10 Germans would fail to reach the rear echelon. This was not sanctioned by command. It was not written in any doctrine. It was simply understood. The Germans understood it too. By nightfall on July 25th, the Black Watch had ceased to exist as a functional military unit. Of the 325 men who advanced across the wheat fields, 15 officers and 227 enlisted men were listed as casualties. The regimental war diary contains an entry for that evening that reads simply, "Unit has sustained losses rendering combat effectiveness nil." But annihilation was not the end of the story. The regiment would be rebuilt within 6 weeks. And what emerged from that reconstruction was something even more terrifying than what had attacked Verrières Ridge. The survivors carried with them a trauma that psychologists would not have vocabulary for until decades later. They had watched their friends terminated in industrial quantities. They had crawled through fields fertilized with the blood of men they had trained with since 1940. There would be no more hesitation. No more half measures. No more concern for the niceties of international law. American military doctrine in 1944 emphasized combined arms warfare. Infantry advanced under cover of artillery and air support. Tanks led assaults while infantry cleared buildings. The entire system was designed to leverage America's overwhelming industrial capacity into tactical advantage. Canadian doctrine took a different approach. The Black Watch had inherited British trench raiding tactics from the First World War and refined them into something almost medieval in its intimacy. Where American units would call in artillery to destroy a fortified position, Canadian units would infiltrate at night, blacken their faces with burnt cork, and eliminate the garrison with knives before the Germans could radio for support. This was not a matter of necessity. Canadian forces had access to the same artillery and air support as their American counterparts. It was a matter of preference. A veteran of the Black Watch, interviewed in 1987 for an oral history project that was never published, described the reasoning with uncomfortable clarity. The Americans wanted to win the war. We wanted to hurt the Germans. There is a difference. This distinction manifested in tactical choices that American commanders found disturbing. During the advance into Germany in early 1945, Black Watch patrols would often bypass German defensive positions rather than engaging them directly. American officers initially interpreted this as caution. They were wrong. The Canadians were bypassing positions because they intended to return at night, without artillery support, without air cover, with nothing but knives, grenades, and 200 years of institutional memory about how to make men disappear in the darkness. The regiment developed a particular fondness for captured German equipment that raised eyebrows among Allied quartermasters. Standard Canadian infantry were issued the Lee Enfield rifle. The Black Watch supplemented their Lee Enfields with German MP-40 submachine guns, captured Walther pistols, and German stick grenades. The preference for German grenades was not random. The Canadian Model 36 grenade had a 4-second fuse. The German steel hand granate had a 5-second fuse, but could be thrown nearly twice as far due to its handle design. More importantly, the German grenade made a distinctive sound when its fuse was pulled, a sound that German soldiers had been trained to recognize. Black Watch raiders learned to pull the fuses, count to 3, and throw. The defenders would hear the familiar sound, dive for cover, expecting the standard 5-second delay, and be caught in the blast because the grenade had already been cooking for 3 seconds in a Canadian hand. The Germans could not trust even the sound of their own weapons. German defensive doctrine was built around the assumption that major attacks would come during daylight, Night operations were expected to be limited to reconnaissance patrols and minor harassment. The Black Watch inverted this assumption entirely. Beginning in August of 1944, the regiment conducted a sustained campaign of nocturnal operations that left German units psychologically shattered. Night after night, Canadian raiders would infiltrate positions, eliminate sentries with knives, plant demolition charges on artillery pieces, and vanish before the garrison could organize a response. The physical casualties from these raids were often modest, 5 or 10 Germans per operation. The psychological impact was catastrophic. German soldiers in sectors opposite Canadian units reported chronic sleep deprivation because standing orders required 50% alert status throughout the night. Men who had survived the Eastern Front began requesting transfers rather than spend another week listening for Canadian infiltrators in the darkness. A German lieutenant's diary, captured in March of 1945, contains an entry that Canadian military historians quote with grim satisfaction. "It is the waiting that destroys us. Every sound in the night, every shadow, they come when we are weakest and vanish before we can respond. I would rather face the Russian artillery than another week of the Canadians." But the nocturnal terror was only one element of what was to come. October of 1944. The flooded lowlands of Belgium and the Netherlands. The Allied advance across France had created a logistical nightmare. Nearly all supplies were still coming through the original Normandy beachheads. The solution was obvious. Open the port of Antwerp. There was one problem. The Scheldt estuary remained in German hands, and the Germans had fortified it with the same thoroughness they had applied to Verrières Ridge. The conditions were almost incomprehensibly miserable. The Germans had deliberately flooded the polders, creating a nightmare landscape of muddy islands, half-submerged roads, and waterways too shallow for boats but too deep for wading. The only approaches to German positions were narrow causeways that could be covered by a single machine gun team. American commanders who reviewed the operational plans expressed skepticism that the objective could be achieved without unacceptable casualties. Canadian commanders did not share this assessment. The Black Watch developed a counter-strategy that combined technological improvisation with their traditional approach to close combat. When artillery and smoke proved insufficient to suppress German positions, small teams would move along the causeway edges, wading through chest-deep water cold enough to cause hypothermia within 30 minutes. These teams would approach from unexpected angles, emerging from the flooded fields like something from a nightmare. Soldiers who had been focused on the causeway would suddenly find themselves engaged at close quarters by mud-covered Canadians who had spent the last hour submerged in freezing water. The engagements were brief and extraordinarily violent. German defenders reported that Canadian soldiers would sometimes continue advancing after sustaining wounds that should have been immediately incapacitating. Men with bullet wounds in their torsos would close to knife range before collapsing. This was not superhuman resilience. This was the numbing effect of hypothermia combined with adrenaline and the institutional expectation that Black Watch soldiers would advance until physically incapable of movement. The Battle of the Scheldt lasted 5 weeks and cost over 12,000 Canadian casualties. The Black Watch emerged with barely 200 men capable of continuing operations. But they emerged victorious. November of 1944. The island of Walcheren, the final obstacle in the Scheldt estuary. The Germans had flooded most of the island's interior by breaching the dikes, leaving only the coastal margins defensible. These margins were lined with concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and the remains of a garrison that had been retreating for weeks. The fighting reached a level of intensity that veterans described in terms usually reserved for the Eastern Front. German defenders, knowing they had nowhere to retreat, fought with desperate tenacity. Canadian attackers, after 5 weeks of continuous combat in the worst conditions the European theatre could offer, fought with a cold fury that had long since burned away any capacity for mercy. The village-by-village clearing produced scenes that Allied war correspondents were prohibited from describing in their dispatches. A German warrant officer captured on the final day of fighting provided testimony that Canadian intelligence officers found remarkable enough to preserve verbatim. "Your men fight like we did in Russia. I did not think the Western Allies had such soldiers. In Russia, we knew we were fighting for survival. I did not expect the same from Canadians." He was asked what specifically prompted this observation. His response: "The eyes. Your men have the same eyes as ours did after Stalingrad. Eyes that have seen too much. Eyes that are no longer afraid because they no longer care." Military historians often overlook the evidence embedded in equipment requisition records. Between August of 1944 and April of 1945, the Black Watch requisitioned replacement bayonets at a rate 340% higher than the Canadian infantry average. Replacement entrenching tools at 412%. Replacement fighting knives at 567%. These were not losses to enemy action. These were items worn out through use. The mathematics are uncomfortable. A bayonet does not wear out from being fixed to a rifle. An entrenching tool does not require replacement from digging foxholes. A fighting knife does not become unserviceable from cutting wire or opening ration cans. These items wear out from being used against human bodies. The requisition records suggest close combat at a frequency that defied contemporary understanding of modern warfare, while American units expended ammunition at rates that strained Allied logistics. The Black Watch was terminating enemies with tools that had been obsolete since the advent of repeating firearms. Relations between Canadian and American units were officially characterized as excellent. The reality was considerably more complex. A report from an American infantry commander who shared a sector with the Black Watch in February of 1945 contains a passage that was later classified. "The Canadians operate with an efficiency that I can only describe as unsettling. Their tactical competence is beyond question. However, I have concerns about certain practices that appear inconsistent with established protocols regarding treatment of prisoners and wounded enemy personnel. American forces were under strict orders to process prisoners through established channels. Captured Germans were to be disarmed, documented, and transported to rear echelon holding facilities. The Black Watch appeared to operate under different priorities. German soldiers in sectors opposite Canadian units surrendered in dramatically lower numbers than in American sectors. Not because the Canadians fought harder, but because fewer surrenders were accepted. The official explanation was that Canadian units maintained aggressive forward positioning that made it difficult to process prisoners during active operations. Veterans told a different story. The Black Watch traces its lineage to 1725, when independent companies of Highland soldiers were formed to pacify the Scottish clans after the Jacobite risings. The regiment's original mission was not conventional warfare. It was suppression, intimidation, the projection of imperial power into hostile territory where traditional tactics were insufficient. This institutional memory, 2 centuries of operating in environments where the rules of conventional warfare did not apply, shaped the regiment's approach in ways that horrified their American allies. The Black Watch had fought in the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the Boer War, and the First World War. In each conflict, the regiment had adapted to local conditions in ways that prioritized effectiveness over adherence to emerging norms of military conduct. By 1944, this adaptation had produced soldiers who viewed the Geneva Convention as a set of suggestions that applied primarily to enemies who themselves observed its restrictions. The SS had violated those restrictions at the Abbaye d'Ardenne. The Black Watch responded in kind. February of 1945. The crossing of the Rhine and the final invasion of Germany. The regiment entered Germany proper with a reputation that preceded them by miles. German civilians who had been prepared to resist the Allied occupation melted away when they learned which units were approaching. Some communities fought with suicidal determination. These communities tended to cease existing as functioning settlements shortly after Canadian forces moved through them. Official Canadian military records describe these engagements with careful bureaucratic neutrality. Resistance encountered. Resistance suppressed. Town secured. Local records tell a more complete story. Communities that resisted Canadian advances experienced casualty rates among military-age males that approached totality. Not all of these casualties were the result of combat. April and May of 1945. Canadian forces participated in the liberation of the Netherlands, a campaign that Dutch civilians would remember with profound gratitude for generations. Starving after the hunger winter, Dutch civilians greeted Canadian soldiers as saviours. But the liberation also brought Canadian forces into contact with evidence of German atrocities that exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The concentration camps of the Netherlands and northern Germany were smaller than the industrial extermination centres of Poland, but they were no less horrifying. Canadian soldiers who entered these camps emerged with a psychological burden that would shape their conduct for the remainder of the war. A Black Watch sergeant who participated in the liberation of a camp near the German-Dutch border provided testimony in 1947 that was sealed for 50 years. After we saw what they had done, what they had been doing for years, while we fought our way across France. I cannot say that we treated prisoners with the consideration that the regulations required. I cannot say that, and I cannot say I regret it. German soldiers continued surrendering to American units in preference to Canadian units until the final day of the war. The Black Watch landed in France in July of 1944, with a fighting strength of approximately 800 men. By May of 1945, the regiment had processed over 2,400 replacements. The total casualty figure for the 11 months of combat exceeded 1,600 men wounded, missing, or no longer among the living. This represents a casualty rate exceeding 200% of original strength. American units that sustained similar rates were typically disbanded and reorganized. The Black Watch simply absorbed replacements and continued fighting. The regiment's ratio of enemy casualties inflicted to friendly casualties sustained has never been officially calculated. Veterans estimate between 6-1 and 10-1. Figures that would be exceptional for any unit in any theatre. German units that faced the Black Watch sustained, on average, 42% higher casualties than equivalent units facing American formations. This statistic, buried in post-war German archives, provides quantitative confirmation of what every German soldier who survived the Western Front already knew. The Canadians were different. The regiment returned to Canada in the summer of 1945 to parades and celebrations that their internal state could not match. They had done things. They had seen things. They had become things that the Canada of 1945 was not prepared to acknowledge. The official history presented a carefully sanitized account. Heroism was emphasized. Sacrifice was honored. The uncomfortable details were elided with professional discretion. But the veterans remembered. In the quiet conversations of regimental reunions, in the careful silences when family members asked about the war, in the nightmares that continued for decades, the truth persisted. Let us conclude with a comparison that American military historians find professionally inconvenient. The United States Army's most elite formation in the European theatre was the Rangers, volunteer units modelled on British commandos. The Rangers trained hard, fought bravely, and earned a reputation for exceptional performance. The Canadian equivalent was not Special Forces. The Canadian equivalent was simply the regular infantry. Units like the Black Watch were not given specialized training beyond standard doctrine. They were not selected through rigorous screening processes. They were ordinary Canadians who volunteered to fight, and they fought with an effectiveness that matched or exceeded the elite formations of any Allied nation. This is the story that Hollywood does not tell. While American audiences were fed narratives of Rangers storming Pointe du Hoc, Canadian infantry units were achieving comparable feats with none of the recognition. The Black Watch did not need special designation to become one of the most feared units in the Allied order of battle. They needed only the opportunity to demonstrate what Canadian volunteers could accomplish when pointed at the German war machine. The Germans learned this lesson at Verrières Ridge. They relearned it at the Scheldt. They learned it again as the Black Watch advanced through the ruins of their 1,000-year Reich. And then, for decades, the world forgot. These were not monsters. These were not war criminals. These were Canadians who did what their country asked of them, in the worst circumstances imaginable, against an enemy that had forfeited any claim to mercy through its own conduct. They deserve to be remembered, not as symbols of nationalistic pride, but as human beings who faced an impossible situation and emerged victorious, scarred, transformed, but victorious. The regiment that made the SS afraid to face them. The volunteers who taught the German war machine what Canadian determination truly meant. They drank mud and blood, and they made the Germans drink it too.